Appreciate your attention on the video and like for it. She postponed her discussion until you settled, not due to seeking approval, but to secure your undivided focus. Placing her phone face down on the table and adopting her usual meeting stance, she began to speak with a measured tone, as if recounting an already decided plan. She disclosed that our marriage had changed. She admitted to having an emotional bond with Ethan. Choosing her words carefully, she enunciated each one clearly, avoiding any confusion. She maintained it wasn't an affair but a partnership, something innovative, something that rekindled her feelings. Then she presented me with two choices: either embrace a revised model for our marriage, one devoid of anticipated intimacy and allowing closeness at her convenience, or step back gracefully, granting her the room to explore her next steps. The dishwasher cycled as it switched modes. Outside, a vehicle drove past, its headlights casting a glow on the kitchen wall. She meticulously cleaned my face, anticipating a response she could manipulate. I remained silent, refraining from confrontation. I let her complete her task. When I informed her that neither option suited me, she appeared genuinely startled. She asserted these were the only practical alternatives. She claimed this was genuine honesty. She claimed adults adjusted. I pushed my chair away, stood up, and informed her there existed another possibility. She inquired about my meaning. I picked up my keys and exited, leaving her seated with hands still folded, already planning a discussion that was on the verge of disappearing. 3 days later, during a client presentation at her office, someone delivered an envelope bearing her name. By the time her phone began to ring, my response was already progressing through the system. The marriage didn't shatter in a single instant. Instead, it grew increasingly fragile, like something overstretched and never allowed to return to its original form. For the past 11 months, it seemed Ethan's name echoed more frequently within our household than mine did. During meals, she mentioned him, often between bites, discussing his method of brainstorming, his assertiveness with clients, and how their discussions never felt insignificant. She expressed that he got her creatively, speaking the words gently, a tone she seldom employed towards me. Upon inquiring about an unrelated matter, she dismissed it, stating she had already discussed it at work. When I proposed an evening together, she glanced at her calendar without meeting my eyes and mentioned there was a late appointment. When I suggested a weekend getaway, she sighed, asserting that current momentum was crucial. She began arriving home restless, setting down her bag by the door and immediately opening her laptop before removing her coat. She offered a fleeting kiss on the cheek, distracted, already halfway engrossed in whatever conversation she had departed from. At night, she was next to me, scrolling on her phone, smiling at its screen while subconsciously angling it away. Her device ceased to rest face up and instead lay flat on tables, couches, or nightstands. Passwords were altered, notifications became mute. When it buzzed, she glanced at it before slipping it into her pocket. Weekends morphed into strategy sessions. Upon return, she seemed energized yet distant, speaking rapidly while already planning the next task. I stood in the doorway observing as she unpacked, waiting for her to lift her gaze and recognize my presence. Usually, she failed to do so. Prior to our kitchen discussion, I drove to her workplace late at night because she said she'd finished by 9 and hadn't responded to my latest message. The parking garage was almost vacant. The quietness that lingered made footsteps reverberate longer than usual. I ascended the elevator solitarily, observing figures ascend, mentally blank, anticipating nothing. The majority of the floor was shrouded in darkness. Desks were vacant, chairs withdrawn, nearly empty coffee cups left near keyboards. A single area remained illuminated, the corner conference room with glass walls revealing the cityscape. I paused before arriving there, hiding in the hall's shadow where light didn't fully penetrate. She was seated on the table's edge, hovering above the ground, reclining on her hands. Ethan stood near, proximity suggesting no potential for misinterpretation. His hands rested casually on her hips, a gesture stemming from habit rather than instinct. She laughed, a sound used when she felt appreciated, head tilted backward, shoulders relaxed. He spoke words I didn't catch, and she beckoned him, fingers curling at the nape of his neck, drawing him nearer instead of pushing him away. There was no sense of hurry or uncertainty in the room. It appeared rehearsed. I remained silent, didn't intervene, instead opting to retrace my steps, passing vacant desks and dim screens, descending in the elevator, exiting into the garage. Upon her return, she complained of traffic and inquired about my meal. I replied I couldn't navigate the city. She nodded absent-mindedly, still engrossed in her phone, continuing to scroll. The subsequent morning, she discussed deadlines and appointments as though the previous night was inconsequential. I conceded without objection. Following her ultimatum, our home didn't erupt into heated debates as one might expect. Instead, it transformed into a quieter, denser atmosphere. She moved through the rooms, suggesting the conversation had already been decided in her favor, brewing coffee the next morning, responding to emails at the counter, discussing deliverables as if nothing breakable had been placed on the table the previous night. When she brought up Ethan again, it was casual, almost comforting. She stated he respected boundaries. One, she acknowledged his grasp of complex situations. She commended me for coping better than she anticipated. Both statements were crafted to maintain my status quo. I requested some time to contemplate. She agreed, noticeably relaxed, and returned to her schedule, filled with meetings, late nights, and a weekend marked as unavailable. Before departing for work, she kissed my cheek and praised my maturity. The very same morning, I visited a downtown low-rise building and identified myself at the reception desk. The office had an aroma of paper and coffee. The attorney listened attentively as I detailed the nighttime office occurrences, the timings, and the card transactions that weren't work-related expenses. He remained impassive when I mentioned Ethan. He merely noted down information and inquired about dates. Upon my conclusion, he organized the papers methodically and asserted my case was robust. 2 days later, I signed all documents he presented to me without a prepared speech. I didn't anticipate the optimal timing. The courier handed over documents to her office on a Friday afternoon, arriving as she stood discussing trust and alignment with a crowd. When I returned to my desk, she was already opening the envelope, facing an unexpected future not considered among her plans. My phone buzzed before the courier had even reached the elevator. Sitting at my desk, with screens active but ignoring emails, I feigned attention. The first call came, followed quickly by the second. On the third ring, I picked up. Her voice was shaky, hurried, lacking the usual poise for tough talks. She asked if it was genuine. She inquired about my reasons. She questioned why I would do this at her workplace during a presentation to her team. She reminded me we had agreed to discuss first. She said this wasn't how mature individuals handled matters. I acknowledged that she was the one who set the options. I informed her she stated I could either adopt the new format or step back. I declared I opted for divorce formally, through documents rather than discussions. She attempted to stall the situation. She asserted I misconstrued her intentions. She claimed she was being truthful with me before matters escalated. She said Ethan was merely a collaborator and that I was overreacting. I told her honesty didn't postpone repercussions. The call ended then. That night, while I was still at work, a lengthy message arrived. She wrote about embarrassment, about leadership confronting her, about gossip. She wrote that Ethan was astounded by the timing, that it would haunt her. I perused it once, seated in my car before driving home. Then I blocked her number, her email, and every shared account still granting her access to me. Upon arriving home, the house was tranquil. Her laptop lay open on the counter, slides frozen mid-transition. I closed it without scrutinizing. She arrived late. She stood in the corridor for a while, her phone clutched as if seeking answers, before walking past the guest room without a knock. The understanding didn't come suddenly. It began with a silence where dominance once resided. I departed a week later in the stillness of the early morning when the street was hushed and the house seemed to be holding its breath. I took my time. I gathered clothes from the wardrobe, my work laptop, some chargers, and everyday items I used unconsciously. I left behind the rest. The framed photos remained on the walls, her books stayed on the shelves. There was no need for the house to appear wiped clean. It merely needed to cease being mine. My new apartment was compact and situated near my workplace. Bare walls, empty counters, rooms devoid of embedded history. I arranged my desk that very night and logged into work as if it were an ordinary weekday. Meetings commenced. Reports were issued. No one raised queries. At her agency, however, the questions persisted. A couple of days following my relocation, a communication arrived from someone I scarcely knew, Emily, a junior designer whom I had met only at annual gatherings. She explained her apologies for reaching out unexpectedly, but believed it necessary to inform me about the events following our presentation. She recounted that after the meeting concluded and everyone started packing up, Ethan exited the room without addressing my wife. He didn't turn around, he didn't wait for her, he didn't send a message later. For 3 days, he kept his distance from her entirely. Meetings were rescheduled, and conversations in the hallways abruptly ended when she attempted to engage him. When they eventually spoke, it wasn't within the office premises. Emily revealed that he mentioned the situation had become too noticeable, that management was discomforted, and that he needed to reflect on his future. He delivered this statement calmly and professionally. Emily added that my wife retired to the restroom afterward and quietly wept, striving not to attract attention. I scrutinized the message for a while, then placed my phone on the table, screen down. The change wasn't immediate. It surfaced in vacant evenings, calls from blocked numbers, and spaces that no longer adjusted themselves due to her presence. A week later, I met Dan for lunch at our usual spot near the office, a place where we had dined many times without ever discussing personal matters. He waited until our meals arrived before speaking, observing me as people do when they already have the answer but still wish to hear it. He mentioned he'd heard I moved out, not as a query, simply a declaration. He commented that most would attempt to reclaim control, even when it had vanished. He noted that I didn't do that. I responded with an indifferent shrug and continued eating. I informed him I wasn't keen on picking between choices intended to reduce me rather than empower. He nodded once, implying understanding, and refrained from further inquiry. After completing lunch individually and returning to work without further discussion or advice, a week later, a message from Dan appeared on my screen, containing only a LinkedIn link. The post announced Ethan's promotion and transfer to the New York office, accompanied by professional photos of him standing before glass towers with a confident smile, and Emily standing beside him in her new role and city, her name neatly positioned below his as if she was meant to be there all along. I saved the link without contemplating why. That evening, while sorting through unpacked boxes, I found an old external drive we'd shared years prior. I cleaned it, discarded it in a recycling bin as I exited, and didn't glance back. The assistance wasn't delivered with speeches. It was provided through subtle indications that I wasn't alone in witnessing the events. I encountered her once more, slightly over a month later, outside the courthouse on a gloomy day that made the building appear heavier than usual. She stood near the steps, clutching a folder to her chest and swaying from one foot to another as if unsure of where to position herself. No colleagues were present, no phone conversation in progress, just her waiting. Upon noticing me, her expression transformed in a manner I had not previously observed, more unguarded, more vulnerable, as if she hadn't fabricated the suitable persona for this moment. Inside, events transpired swiftly, names verified, documents slid across the table, pins were exchanged back and forth. The clerk elucidated the procedure without looking at either of us. After completion, the folder became slimmer and lighter, no longer pliable with words. We exited independently but halted a few paces apart. She moved first. She apologized, stating she didn't wish for things to conclude this way. She declared Ethan was not as he appeared. Her tone softened when mentioning his name, as if it held little weight now. She inquired if there was any opportunity to delay, discuss, comprehend the circumstances. I retrieved my phone, unlocked the link Dan had shared weeks ago, and displayed the image on the screen. Ethan stood amidst a New York skyline with Emily beside him, grinning. Her revised position appeared under her name. She scrutinized it for an extended duration. Then she inquired about Emily's age, already aware of the response. Upon uttering the figure, it seemed incorrect coming from her lips. I replaced the device and informed her our association had ended. She stood there holding the file tightly, her gaze unfocused, as if attempting to fit herself into a narrative that had progressed without her. I walked towards the exit, and she did not follow. The guard kept the door open for me. She remained on the steps, clutching documents that no longer held any power over her fate. A month after our divorce was finalized, an email arrived late at night from an unrecognizable address. I opened it while seated at my small table in the apartment. A half-eaten cold meal was pushed to one side, the room illuminated by a solitary lamp. It was Emily. She did not mince words. She stated she wanted me to know the truth because no one else had ever spoken it aloud. She wrote that Ethan had been seeing both of us for several months. She wrote that it began during the same strategy meeting my wife attended, which she returned from with a radiant and detached demeanor. Emily described the weekend in straightforward terms. On Saturday night, she was with my wife. On a Sunday evening with her, inhabiting separate hotel rooms. Both offered similar excuses about work commitments prolonging, expressing their unique perspectives and conviction of being chosen. However, upon the announcement of our divorce, the overlap that had once been invisible became glaringly apparent. Leadership began querying and meetings subtly shifted, transitioning from conference rooms to corridors before ceasing altogether. Ethan swiftly chose a transfer to New York, bringing Emily along. Younger, unmarried, and free of any public ties to her name, she was an easy choice. The agency retained my ex, keeping their original setup intact without Ethan, sans the promised future. Emily declared her resignation 2 weeks later, clearing out her desk and leaving without a glance back. She asserted that my departure demonstrated she didn't need to remain there either. In response, I extended a solitary message, wishing her luck and closing the conversation. No further exchanges ensued. The aftermath of our separation unfolded without me present. Several days later, I unintentionally encountered her at a cafe in our old neighborhood, a place known for its familiarity with her due to her frequent visits. She stood alone outside the establishment, seemingly engrossed in her phone without typing anything. She stepped aside every time someone approached closely, exhibiting an altered posture, hunched shoulders, and lowered head, as if she was trying to evade attention and grapple with an unsettling emotion. She remained oblivious to my presence, and I crossed the street when the signal permitted. That evening in my apartment, I prepared dinner while standing at the counter, as I had yet to buy a table. The plate was washed, dried, and put away afterwards. My phone lay beside the sink, devoid of any notifications. The following morning at work, my ID card functioned flawlessly on its first attempt, and the day transpired as scheduled without interruptions or inquiries regarding my well-being. A mutual acquaintance later informed me that she was still employed at the agency, maintaining her same role. People no longer looked to her for guidance, projects progressed without her involvement. The room no longer halted for her as it once did. I didn't make contact, nor did she. Eventually, I purged our last conversation from my phone, no revisits, no indecision, just a swift swipe and confirmation. The choices she offered were meant to keep her at the focal point, but I chose neither. Instead, I departed before she could finish explaining the terms, leaving her standing alone with options that no longer applied to her. Thanks for reading until the end. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What's your perspective on this tale?